As-tu une cause qui te tient à cœur? Es-tu engagé à la soutenir? Je te pose la question car je dédie cet épisode 73 au Podcasthon, événement qui a lieu cette année du 15 au 21 mars. L'idée, c'est de soutenir une association, une ONG, avec un épisode de podcast. Mon podcast, DÉPROGRAMMONS-NOUS, ça urge, parle de se déconditionner pour vivre la meilleure vie possible dans la joie et l'abondance, et je souhaite soutenir aujourd'hui le Jane Goodall Institute France. Est-ce que tu connais le Dr Jane Goodall? Allez, réfléchis. Tu as sûrement un jour entendu parler d'une jeune femme qui a étudié les chimpanzés dans leur milieu naturel en Afrique dans les années 60. Ça y est, tu te souviens ou pas? Peu importe, le Dr Jane Goodall a bercé mon enfance. Moi qui regardais beaucoup de documentaires animaliers, moi qui lisais plein de livres sur les animaux. En tant que scientifique, primatologue et éthologue, le Dr Jane Goodall a révolutionné les recherches de sa discipline en utilisant une méthodologie de travail bien à elle. C'est une femme qui m'a toujours inspirée et je souhaite lui rendre hommage dans le cadre du Podcasthon 2025. C'est un honneur pour moi, une joie que le Jane Goodall Institute France m'autorise à utiliser la conférence du Dr Jane Goodall du 19 octobre 2024 à l'UNESCO. Je tiens à remercier chaleureusement la directrice du Jane Goodall Institute France, Galitt Kenan, qui m'a donné son feu vert pour cette mise en lumière du Dr Jane Goodall et de son œuvre. Dans un premier temps, nous allons accueillir Galitt Kenan, puis je t'offrirai des moments choisis de la conférence qui s'intitule Une parole pour l'histoire du Dr Jane Goodall. Bien sûr, je choisis les moments les plus inspirants, les plus porteurs de sens, ceux qui te montrent comment cette femme née en 1934 a dégommé des codes, a changé des pratiques, a bousculé les mentalités, comment cette femme est devenue une scientifique exceptionnelle qui, à 90 ans, marque encore son temps. Une femme qui vit en conscience, qui sait depuis toujours créer sa réalité, vivre la vie de ses rêves. Sans plus attendre, accueillons Galitt Kenan, directrice du Jane Goodall Institute France. Bonjour Galitt.
Bonjour Elisabeth, je suis ravie de participer à ce podcast.
Encore merci de me faire l'honneur de cet épisode spécial Podcasthon. J'aimerais savoir ce qui vous a personnellement amené à rejoindre le Jane Goodall Institute.
J'ai eu la chance de rejoindre le Jane Goodall Institute comme une évidence en fait. J'ai d'abord travaillé dans le rapport entre les humains en organisant un congrès avec 100 rabbins et 100 imams du monde entier. L'intime conviction que le rapport à l'autre, le respect de l'autre était fondamental dans nos vies. Et ensuite, j'ai eu la chance de pouvoir travailler avec Yann Arthus-Bertrand en dirigeant un projet qui s'appelle 6 milliards d'autres, une sorte de portrait vidéo de l'humanité à un moment T donné, où là aussi on essayait de comprendre le rapport entre les humains et la nature, comment le respect était et devait être au cœur de tout cela. Et donc travailler au Jane Goodall Institute, c'était travailler sur ce rapport à l'autre, ce respect de l'autre, cette empathie pour l'autre, que ce soit pour les humains, les autres animaux ou notre environnement partagé. Donc, rejoindre le Jane Goodall Institute, ça a été une évidence pour moi.
Waouh, quel parcours Galitt. Vos mots me percutent en plein cœur et m'émeuvent. Merci infiniment. Pouvez-vous me parler de vos principales missions au sein du Jane Goodall Institute France?
Les missions du Jane Goodall Institute France sont très diverses. D'abord, nous travaillons bien sûr sur la recherche scientifique, puisqu'elles sont au cœur de nos actions. Nous avons la chance de travailler et d'œuvrer sur le terrain en Afrique comme en France sur des projets qui ont vocation de protéger les animaux. En Afrique, les chimpanzés sauvages, mais en France, ça peut être toutes sortes d'animaux et leur environnement. Et en prenant en considération que ce travail ne peut être fait que par pour et avec les populations locales. Et c'est vrai que au Jane Goodall Institute France, nous avons 2 autres programmes qui sont très importants pour nous. D'abord, nous avons une action de plaidoyer, qu'elle soit publique ou bien qu'elle soit plus discrète. Et ensuite, ce programme qui est au cœur vraiment à la fois de nos actions et des intentions de Jane, qui s'appelle Roots and Shoots, des racines et des bourgeons, qui a pour vocation euh, d'aider les jeunes qui souhaitent agir pour un monde meilleur en les accompagnant et en les incitant à l'action.
C'est tellement impressionnant de réaliser toute l'implication de votre organisation au plan mondial. Quel engagement fort! J'aimerais beaucoup savoir pourquoi ce discours du Dr Jane Goodall à l'UNESCO s'intitule « Parole pour l'histoire ».
Une parole pour l'histoire, Speech for History, c'est le titre que l'UNESCO a donné à 4 discours maintenant. Un qui a été fait par le pape Jean-Paul II, un par Nelson Mandela et un par Claude Lévi-Strauss. Donc c'est un cadre très particulier de conférences très prestigieuses qui sont réalisées au sein de l'UNESCO dans le cadre de leur mission de sensibilisation et d'apporter la paix au sein des populations.
On comprend bien la place, le rang que le Dr Jane Goodall occupe. Ambassadrice de la paix, waouh! Merci infiniment Galitt. Chers auditeurs, nous allons maintenant donner la parole au Dr Jane Goodall. Déjà, j'ai choisi ce premier extrait pour que tu comprennes ce qu'est le Jane Goodall Institute et la vision de Jane. Au passage, tu vas aussi entendre son humour.
Today, the world is in such a state that no one organization can do it alone. We need to collaborate, we need to get together, we need countries and individuals to work together to make this a better world so that we can be a little bit proud of what we leave for our children. But first of all, because I'm absolutely sure that never before in this space has there been a proper acknowledgement that we humans are not the only beings on the planet. So I want to bring into this space the voice of the chimpanzee, the animal I've studied for so many years with my dedicated team. And what I'm going to say simply means this is me, this is Jane, because the chimpanzees have different ways of announcing their presence. So this is it's a distance call. It's very appropriate for you guys up in the balcony. So, to start with, the Jane Goodall Institute, let me just quickly explain, because some people don't understand what a global institute we have become since it began in 1977. There are 25 chapters of the Jane Goodall Institute around the world. There is a global Jane Goodall Institute which collates and makes sure that the different chapters are abiding by the mission of the Jane Goodall Institute. Our program for young people, Roots and Shoots, is in 74 countries and growing all the time. And finally, because I want to be sure that this complicated organization will continue and continue to grow after I'm gone, and I am 90, so I don't know how many more years left I have, but then there is a Jane Goodall Legacy Foundation so that we can build up an endowment.
J'ai choisi ce deuxième passage pour que tu vois qu'à 90 ans, et avec la carrière, les actions magistrales que le Dr Jane Goodall a réalisées, eh bien cette femme est d'une humilité extraordinaire et vous une reconnaissance infinie à une personne. Je te laisse écouter.
I want to pay, first of all, very special thanks to the person who's really enabled me to be who I am and to some extent enabled me to do what I've done. We can't choose, I don't think anyway, we can't choose where we're born, we can't choose who our parents are. But I got lucky. I got lucky in having the most extraordinary mother. I was born loving animals, all kinds of animals, and she was just so supportive. And to give you one example, when I was 4.5 years old, she took me for a holiday onto a farm in the country, a proper farm, not these terrible factory farms that we have today. And so I met for the first time cows and pigs out in the fields, and I was given a job to collect the hens' eggs. And the hens pecked around in the farmyard, but at night they slept in these little wooden hen houses to keep them safe from foxes. So my job was to go and collect the eggs. So I'd go around these little hen houses, and if there was an egg, I would put it in my basket. But I kept asking people, but where does the egg come out of the hen? Because I can't see a hole that big. And nobody told me. So one day, and I remember this really well, I saw a hen, she was brown, and she was going into one of these hen houses. And I must have thought, she's going to lay an egg. So I crawled after her. Big mistake, squawks of fear, she flew out. But now I'm on the path of discovery. I'm going to jolly well find out how this egg comes out. So I waited in an empty hen house, and I waited for 4 hours. For a child of 4, some of you are parents, that's a lot of patience. And so my mother was about to call the police. Nobody knew where I was. And then she sees this excited little girl rushing towards the house because I had seen how a hen lays an egg and where the egg comes out. And I don't know who was more excited, me or the hen. Buck, 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 buck. You know that. Anyway, so she sat down to hear this wonderful story of how a hen lays an egg. And I tell that story because isn't that the making of a little scientist? Curiosity, asking questions, not getting the right answer, deciding to find out for yourself, making a mistake, not giving up, and learning patience. It was all there, and a different kind of mother might have crushed that early scientific curiosity, and I might not have done what I've done. So she went on supporting me through my childhood. From the age of 5, World War II was raging. Television hadn't been invented back then. And so I was learning by being out in the garden. It was my grandmother's garden. We went there when war broke out. So out in this big garden, I watched the squirrels and the birds and the insects.
T'as vu ça? Premières observations, détermination de Jane Goodall à 4 ans et demi pour comprendre d'où sort l'œuf de poule. Tu vas voir maintenant comment un destin se dessine. Comment une enfant pauvre, une fille de surcroît, va créer sa vie en saisissant les opportunités. Un voyage, une rencontre déterminante et un poste qui se libère comme par magie. Écoute attentivement.
And because there was no television, it was books. And I loved books. Books came from the library. We had very little money. But I used to save up my pennies, pocket money, and spend Saturday afternoon crawling about in this little old second-hand bookshop. And on this occasion, I had just enough money to buy a very small second-hand book called Tarzan of the Apes. You know Tarzan from television and from movies, but I learned about Tarzan from the book. And of course I fell passionately in love with this glorious Lord of the Jungle. And what did he do? He married the wrong Jane. Well, of course I knew there wasn't a Tarzan, but that's when my dream began. I will grow up, go to Africa, live with wild animals and write books about them. No thought of being a scientist. Girls didn't do that sort of thing. And everybody laughed at me. How will you do that? You don't have money. Back then, we thought of Africa as the dark continent, very dangerous place. And anyway, I was just a girl, but not my mother. And this was so important in my life that she said, if you really want to do this, you're going to have to work really hard and take advantage of every opportunity. And if you don't give up, hopefully you find a way. And because of that, I've been able to take this message around the world and talk to young people, particularly in disadvantaged communities. And so many of them have later said to me, thank you, Jane, you taught me because you did it, I can do it too. And many of them have decided to spend their life learning about animals and the natural world because of that. So there I am, 10 years old, growing up, no money for university, had to get a job, because I say we had little money. Got a job, well, first of all, did a secretarial course, which I didn't want to do. But again, my mother wisely said, if you're going to do it, give it everything you've got. You may not want to be a secretary, but be the best secretary you can. So I did work hard, and I got a wonderful job in London. But then came opportunity, a letter from a school friend inviting me for a holiday in Kenya, where her parents had bought a farm. And so I couldn't save up money in London. I went home. I worked as a waitress in a hotel around the corner. Really hard work. And it was my first experience of learning a new culture, because all the other waiters and waitresses were professional, and they came from Ireland. They were Irish Catholics. And so I learned that whole new culture, which is very different. Anyway, I finally saved up enough money, took about 5 months, and I had enough money for a return fare to Kenya. Well, in those days, of course, there were some planes, but they were very expensive. So I went by boat. It was a journey that took nearly a month because the Suez Canal was closed because of a war between Britain and Egypt. So the boat had to go all the way around Cape Town. And it was so exciting. Left England when it was grey and cold. The sea became bluer. I began to see flying fish. And then closer to the Cape, dolphins. And the first place where I set foot on African soil was Cape Town. Arriving in Kenya, it was different. Kenya was on the very brink of independence from British colonial rule. Stayed with my friend. Somebody said, if you're interested in animals, you should meet Dr. Louis Leakey, famous paleontologist, searching for the earliest humans in different parts of Africa. And I went to see him. He was head of the Natural History Museum in Nairobi. He took me all around. He asked me lots of questions. And because I had spent as long as I could in the Natural History Museum in London, and because I'd read every book I could about the animals of East Africa, I could answer a lot of his questions. Now, I talked about that boring secretarial job, training. Guess what? Just 2 days before I went to meet Leakey, his secretary had suddenly left. He needed a secretary, and there I was. And now I'm surrounded by people who can answer all my questions about the animals and plants of East Africa. And it wasn't like being a normal secretary. I was in the same room as him, and there were always interesting people coming in, and I was allowed to take my little bush baby, who slept in a gourd above Louis Leakey's desk. And when a visitor came, the bush baby's little face would poke out, and then he'd come out and suddenly leap onto this poor man's head. He didn't expect it, so it was quite funny to see the reaction. Leaky didn't mind at all. So there I was, and Leaky allowed me to go with his wife, one other young English girl, to what at that time was a 3-month visit every year to a very famous fossil site, Olduvai Gorge. Back then, nobody'd heard of it. It was the Leakys who felt that the Oldovan pebbles were actually Stone Age tools. Nobody believed them. And in those days, some of you may have been to the Serengeti and marveled at the animals there. Back then, there was no road. There was no road from Arusha to Serenera. There was just a very rough track. There was not even a track to Olduvai Gorge. And how the Leakys found their way there, it's hard to tell in this great open plain. All the animals were there. There was just so many animals there. And we camped for 3 months. The only human beings we saw were 4 Maasai warriors. And Julian and I were allowed to walk out in the evening after the hard day's work looking for fossils. And on this occasion, something made me look behind. And there, about the distance across this auditorium, was a young male lion. He was fully grown. His mane was beginning to grow. He was just standing, looking, his tail gently waving. I think he was just curious. Well, Gillian wanted to hide in the vegetation at the bottom of the gorge. And I said, Gillian, the lion will know where we are. We won't know where the lion is. We need to go up onto the plains, which is what we did. And I think it was that evening around the campfire that Leaky decided I was the person he'd been looking for to go and learn about the behavior of chimpanzees in the wild. Nobody had done that. And of course, I was really, really excited. Why did Leaky want me to go and do that? He was searching for the fossilized remains of the early humans. And from a fossil bone, you can tell a lot from where the muscles are attached, was the creature upright, from where on the teeth, the sort of food that was being eaten. But behavior does not fossilize. So Leaky, believing, as we now know to be true, that we and chimpanzees split apart from a common ancestor about 6 million years ago, maybe a little longer. And so he argued, if Jane sees behavior that's similar or the same in chimpanzees today and humans today, maybe that behavior was also in the common ancestor, and they've taken it with them on their long, separate evolutionary pathways. That, he argued, would give him a way of better thinking about how early humans might have behaved. And of course, this is now generally accepted. And so we can think of early humans walking upright. We can think of them using tools before stone tools and things like that. But none of that was known back then.
Est-ce que tu as vu les pièces du puzzle s'assembler comme par magie dans la vie du Dr Jane Goodall? Elle qui rêve d'étudier les animaux en Afrique, son ami lui propose de venir au Kenya. Là, elle rencontre le docteur Louis Leakey, paléontologue. Sa secrétaire lui a fait faux bond, mais Jane est justement secrétaire. Et un jour, le déclic chez le docteur Leakey. Jane a montré, par ses connaissances, son attitude, son comportement, qu'elle est la personne dont il a besoin pour étudier les chimpanzés dans leur milieu naturel. Alignement des planètes, comme on dit. Je suis scotché.
There were 2 problems. First of all, money. I hadn't been to college, remember, but finally a wealthy American said, all right, here's 6 months. We see how she does. Secondly, Tanzania was Tanganyika back then, was part of the crumbling British Empire. And the authorities said, a young girl in a forest on her own? Absolutely not. But Leakey never gave up. So in the end, they said, all right, but she can't come alone. So who volunteered to come? That same remarkable mother. She came for 4 months of my 6 months. After that, the authorities probably thought I was crazy, but seemed to be okay. But the great thing that she did during those 4 months that she was there, first of all, she boosted my morale. I was getting really depressed because as soon as the chimps saw me, they vanished into the undergrowth. They're very shy. And I only had money for 6 months. And after 4 months, there was still only one chimpanzee who was beginning to lose his fear of me. But my mother would say, but Jane, you're learning much more than you think. You found that peak, and with your binoculars, you see that chimpanzees sometimes travel alone, sometimes a mother with her children, sometimes a group of mothers, sometimes a group of males kind of hanging out together. And she said, you're learning how they make nests up in the trees at night. You're learning the kind of foods they eat and the kind of calls they make. So it was really sad that she left just 2 weeks before the breakthrough observation that everybody knows about now, that chimpanzees can use and make tools. And it was that first chimp who began to lose his fear, who I named a David Greybeard because he had the lovely white hair on his chin. And I saw him picking grass stems and using them to fish termites from their burrows and pulling the grass out and eating the insects off with his lips and picking leafy twigs. And to use those as tools, he had to carefully strip the leaves and side branches. At that time, science believed humans, and only humans, could use and make tools. And so it was a very exciting observation. And it was that observation that enabled Leakey to get money for me to carry on when the 4 months ended. He got money from the National Geographic Society. So I could then relax. I knew that I had more time. I'd always known if I had time, I could gain the trust of the chimpanzees. And because of David, his calm presence, he was a born leader. He wasn't the top-ranking male, but he was gentle. And when the young ones were frightened, they would run to him for reassurance. And I suppose when I approached a group that was ready to run, if David was there, he just sat calmly. And I suppose they thought, well, she can't be so frightening after all. And gradually, I was able to get closer. And gradually, I was able to identify each one as an individual. And I got to know David's best friend, Goliath, the top-ranking male, and some of the other males like William and Mr. Wurzel. And I got to know the top-ranking female, old Flo and her family, and Passion and Melissa, and all the rest. And what was so striking was how like us they are. So in their gestures and postures of communication, they kiss, embrace, hold hands, pat one another, beg for food. And the mothers, the relationship with her family, strong bonds that can last through life, as we know today, because the research is still going on. It's in its 64th year. But back then, of course, I didn't know, but the bonds between mother and offspring were very obvious. Friendships between particularly two males will form very strong friendships and support each other in any dispute. And then you get two males competing for dominance, and they do compete for dominance, some of them. And they'll stand upright, and their hair will bristle, and they'll swagger, and they may raise a fist. Does that remind you of some human male politicians? I think so. And I didn't mention any names. Anyway, So it was a bit of a shock to find out that, like us, chimpanzees have their dark side. They can be violent, they can be brutal, they can kill. There are conflicts between neighboring communities. A community is about 50 individuals. And during those inter-community interactions where males will seemingly hunt individuals from the neighboring group, and if they come across one, male or female will attack them so brutally that they die of their wounds. And this shocked me, because I thought that chimps were like us, but nicer. And it's even more shocking to realize that because of this aggression, it made them seem even more like us. But at the same time, just as we have a compassionate, loving, and altruistic side to our nature, so too do they. And I was learning more and more about that as well.
Waouh, je suis encore une fois impressionnée par la reconnaissance si forte encore du Dr Jane Goodall envers sa maman et du lien qui devait les unir. Forcément, un écho sourd et profond à mon histoire personnelle. Ce passage nous montre que lorsque la mission de vie est réalisée, les problèmes, les obstacles disparaissent. Dans le prochain extrait, tu vas voir l'attitude de Jane face à ses pairs. Je suis convaincue que c'est parce qu'elle a d'abord fait ses travaux de recherche sur le comportement des chimpanzés avant d'aller étudier à l'université, qu'elle a créé aussi facilement sa propre méthodologie et qu'elle a fait des découvertes qui ont révolutionné sa discipline et toute la science. Elle n'avait pas le formatage universitaire quand elle a démarré. C'est génial.
After about 2 years, I was told by Leakey that I had to go to get a degree, that there was no time for an undergraduate degree, that he got me a place in Cambridge University in England to do a PhD in animal behavior. So I was very nervous, and imagine how I felt when these learned professors told me I'd done everything wrong. Jane, you should have numbered the chimpanzees, your subjects, not given them names. You shouldn't talk about chimpanzees having personality. You shouldn't talk about them having minds capable of solving problems. And you absolutely cannot talk about them having emotions like happiness, sadness, fear, despair, and so on. Why? Those are unique to humans. And they told me, you cannot have empathy with your subjects. Scientists must be coldly objective. And of course, I had a wonderful teacher when I was a child who taught me that these professors were talking rubbish, that it wasn't true. And I bet many of you have had some kind of animal, a dog, a cat, a rabbit, whatever you've had, a bird. You know perfectly well, we are not the only beings on the planet with personalities, minds, and emotions. And it's perfectly possible to be objective and still have feelings for the being that you're studying. So anyway, I didn't confront them. I went on describing their behavior, and the Geographic sent a filmmaker, and his film was corroborating everything I'd said. So gradually, scientific attitude began to change. It's now called, I'm told, the Jane Goodall method of studying animals. Anyhow, I got my PhD, went back to Gombe. I went back to the best days of my life. I built up a little research station. Gombe is a tiny national park, so very few students. And I could spend hours not only learning about chimps in the forest, but learning about the forest ecosystem, this amazing mixture of animal and plant species, all interdependent and forming the forest ecosystem. When I'm out in these forests, I feel a very strong spiritual connection to the natural world.
Est-ce que tu prends la mesure de la révolution que le Dr Jane Goodall a réalisé avec ses découvertes. Elle parle aussi d'une connexion spirituelle avec la nature. C'est puissant ce qu'elle a vécu, c'est puissant ce qu'elle nous transmet dans ce beau discours. Et pourtant, comme Galitt tout à l'heure, qui parlait d'une évidence à rejoindre le Jane Goodall Institute, eh bien une évidence va s'imposer au Dr Jane Goodall, qui va passer de scientifique passionné à activiste. Je te laisse écouter.
And so, why did I leave? Why did I start traveling around the world, giving talks to people to raise awareness and also, of course, to raise money? But why did I leave Gombe? I could have stayed. I could still be there. But I went to a conference. I helped to start it. And that was in 1986, the middle of the 1980s. And it was by then there were 6 other scientists studying chimps in different parts of Africa. And so we wanted to know how much chimpanzee behavior changed or didn't change according to the environments they were in, whether there were different cultures. If you define culture as behavior passed from one generation to the next through observational learning, I had already talked that I guessed that that would happen, and lo and behold, it's true. There's different ways of tool using. Some foods are eaten in some area and not in others, and that's because the young ones learn by observing and imitating. And because the youngsters have a lot to learn, they have this very long childhood, 4 years between live births, and during those 4 years, the youngster is learning the cultures of his or her community. So, at this conference, we also had a session on conservation, and it was shocking. I learned that right across Africa, wherever chimps were being studied, forests were being destroyed, they were losing their habitats, and their numbers were decreasing. So I went to that conference as a scientist. I left as an activist. People say it must have been a hard decision. It wasn't a decision, it was just something that happened to me. Chimps had given me so much. Now I must do what I could to help them. But I didn't know what to do. However, I got some money again from National Geographic and visited the study sites around Africa to learn more about the plight of the chimpanzees. And of course, there was the growing bushmeat trade, that's the commercial hunting of wild animals for food. Hunters were setting snares to catch antelopes, bush pigs, and so on. And a chimpanzee can get a hand or a foot caught in the wire snare. And although they can break the wire, they can't get the snare off, and so will either lose a hand or a foot or die of gangrene. And then, in addition, of course, to habitat loss, mothers are shot so that babies can be stolen and trafficked around the world to be sold as pets or for some kind of entertainment, circuses and so on. And in addition, as the people moved further and further into the forest, they took with them human diseases. And chimpanzees are so like us, sharing 98.7% of our DNA, so they are able to catch our diseases, and this can have a devastating effect on a chimpanzee community. But at the same time as I was learning all this about the chimps, I was learning about the plight of some of the African people living in and around chimp habitat, the crippling poverty, the lack of good health and education facilities, and also the degradation of the farmland as their populations grew. And it came to a head when I flew over the tiny Gombe National Park. In 1960, when I began, it was part of the equatorial forest belt that stretched from western East Africa right across to the West African coast. But when I flew over in the mid-1980s, to my horror, I looked over a little island of forest that was the national park, and all around the trees were gone, the hills were bare. More people living there than the land can support. Too poor to buy food from elsewhere. Their own farmlands now infertile and overused. Why were they cutting down the trees? Because they were struggling to survive, and they had to try and get some money from charcoal or timber or clear land to grow more food to feed their families. And it hit me then, as I flew over that little Gombe, it hit me, if we can't find ways of helping these people make a living without destroying their environment, we can't save chimpanzees, forests, or anything else. And so back in 1990, we began a wonderful man, George Strundon, who'd worked out in that area of Tanzania already for 15 years. He helped me start a program which is known now as the Takari method, a very holistic program it is. But when we started, then it was a little group of 7 local Tanzanians who were chosen to help initiate this program. It was not a bunch of arrogant white people marching into a very poor African village and telling them what we were going to do to improve their lives. No, these 7 went into the 12 villages around Gombe and sat down and asked the people what JGI could do to help them. And that's where we began. Of course, they wanted more food, which meant restoring fertility to the overused land without agricultural chemicals, by the way. And they wanted better facilities for health and education, particularly for their children. And we worked with the local Tanzanian authorities to improve these. As they came to trust us, we introduced other programs, like water management programs, like finding as many scholarships as we could to give girls a chance of secondary education, because back then it was only the boys who were eligible for that. And then we introduced microfinance, and that was because my great friend Muhammad Yunus, for whom I'm so happy that finally he's now been freed from all these accusations of dishonesty, which I'm sure some of you must have read about. But anyway, he took me to Bangladesh, where he started the Grameen Bank. And I met women who, until he began this program of giving very, very small loans, which the banks wouldn't give, the normal banks. And I met these women, and they told me what it was like when they first had money in their own hands. And so we introduced this microfinance into the villages around Gombe, particularly for women, because unfortunately, although the men can get loans, they tend to drink the profit and then they can't pay back. But the women, of course, are much more eager to save it to feed their families and so on. So it's made a very, very big difference to the living conditions of people living around Gombe. And when I've talked to some of the people, and we have filmed some of the people, they feel if they take out a loan to start a small, environmentally sustainable business, and they pay it back, then they're proud. It's theirs. They've done it themselves. That gives them the pride that's so important when you want to move forward in your life. And then if they wish, they can take out a larger loan. But when they tell me about the difference it's made, it really warms your heart. So also some tree planting as we moved into the villages out beyond Gombe. And so what began with these 12 villages then spread into 104 villages, covering most of the range of chimpanzees in Tanzania. As this program began to show real good results, And as the people's attitude to life and to us began to change, then we were able to bring in our conservation science program, thanks to Dr. Lillian Pintea and some of the local people at Gombe, introducing more modern technology, GIS, GPS, satellite imagery. And this meant that the local people could develop their land use management plans required by the government. It also meant that we could keep much better track of chimpanzee movements, and gradually other technologies were introduced. Today we use drones and camera traps and things of that sort. So this program has turned out to be really successful, and this Takari method is now in 6 other African countries where various Jane Goodall Institute programs are working to study chimpanzees. By this time, I'm beginning to travel around the world, raising awareness about the problems faced by chimps and people in Africa, and also, of course, raising money. Because the Takari program and carrying on the research at Gombe is obviously costing money.
T'as entendu? C'est une conférence qui bouscule, qui bouleverse le Dr Jane Goodall et la transforme en activiste. Et c'est quasi instantané. Et ça la pousse à s'engager différemment pour sauver notre planète, notre monde. Et c'est encore une rencontre avec cette fois George Trandon que le Dr Jane Goodall commence sa nouvelle vie d'activiste. On peut imaginer, considérer que Jane est présente, ouverte à ce qui l'entoure. Et c'est comme ça qu'elle capte les informations qui la font évoluer et contribuer pour elle et les autres. C'est une femme qui vit au présent et qui, comme lui avait recommandé sa maman, saisit les opportunités.
So, as I was traveling around, back in the 90s, I was already meeting young people who were losing hope, way back then. And how shocking. Young people losing hope in high school and university. And 12 high school students came to see me in Dar es Salaam. They had different concerns. They were worried about what was happening in their world. Some of them were worried about the poaching in the national parks. Why wasn't the government doing more about it? They were worried about illegal dynamite fishing. They were worried, some of them, about the street children sniffing glue with no homes. Some were worried about the cruel treatment of stray dogs. And so they wanted me to fix those problems. And I said, I love Tanzania, but I'm not a Tanzanian. They went off to their 8 different schools. They gathered up other friends who felt the same as they did. We had a meeting of about 30 young people in 1991, and then the Jane Goodall Institute's youth program began. We called it Roots and Shoots, and that's based on, think of a big tree. I love trees. You think of a very big tree, it probably began from a little seed, and when it began to grow, you could pick it up and there'd be these little tiny roots and a little tiny shoot, and it would seem so weak and so insignificant. But it's what I call a magic. There's a magic, a life force so strong that those little roots, to reach the water, can work through rocks and eventually push them aside. And that little shoot, to reach the sunlight, can work through a brick wall and eventually knock it down. You've all seen things like that. So we see the young people, the roots and shoots, are working through the problems that we face today and knocking them aside like the rocks and breaking them down like the walls. And we decided on that first meeting, the main message of Roots and Shoots would be every single individual matters, every single individual makes a difference every single day. Don't forget you are important because you make a difference. And when millions of people make the right decisions, this makes a huge impact around the world. People come to me when they're depressed, many people, and they think about the problems of the world and they feel depressed. We all do when we think about the problems facing us today. But I say to them, you can't solve those problems, but what about where you live? Is there something you care about? Maybe you care about plastic litter. Maybe you care about pollution coming from agriculture or household waste. There's something. Well, get some friends together and try and do something about it. And they do, and they find it does make a difference. It makes them feel better, and then they want to do more. So with Roots and Shoots, because everything's interconnected, we decided that each group would choose between them 3 projects, one to help people, one to help other animals, and one to help the environment. And they don't all have to do every one of those projects, but they must share them so that they understand this interconnectedness between the different projects. So what began with 12 high school students is now in 74 countries around the world. We have members from kindergarten through university, and I'm telling you that they are making a difference. There is a growing group of Roots and Shoots across France. I just spoke to many of them. So much enthusiasm, so many great ideas that the young people have when they understand the problems, and we empower them and perhaps help them to make a difference. And this is so important when you think, what are we leaving behind for our children today? We're leaving a flawed world. And this is where I come to the biggest difference between humans and other animals. We know today that animals are way more intelligent than we used to think. Not just the great apes, chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, monkeys, whales, elephants, but we now know that pigs are very intelligent. Some of them are more intelligent than some dogs. And if you don't believe me, Google not Picasso the artist, but Piccasso, and you will see what I mean. Picasso's paintings are selling for about $5,000, and her biggest painting sold for $25,000. And she loves to do it. The person who rescued her from a factory farm is an artist, and she noticed this pig watching her. So she set up an easel, gave the pig a paintbrush with paint on it, and the pig started to paint. You'll love to watch it. And we now know birds are very intelligent, crows particularly, and of course parrots. I know a parrot who knows 1,500 words, and a word is only counted in his vocabulary if he said it twice unprompted in the right context. And then it surely will surprise you to know you can teach goldfish. And there's a Chinese man, and he's got 3 goldfish on this side of the tank and 3 on the other side, and he's taught them to play football. Seriously. These ones try and get the ball in the goal over there, and these ones try to take it away and put it in the goal over there. Goldfish. Bumblebees can be taught to drop a little marble into a hole, and then they get a nectar reward. That's amazing. Other bumblebees who have not been trained can do the same just by watching the trained bumblebees. And then some of you must have seen My Octopus Teacher, and we know the amazing intelligence of the octopus. So, yes, they're very intelligent, but think what we've done. We've sent a rocket up to Mars, little camera. We now know what the surface of Mars looks like. We've got the internet. And these are feats that no animal, however intelligent, could do. But we're not intelligent, are we? We've got this amazing intellect. But if we were intelligent, Homo sapiens, the wise creature. But we're not intelligent, because an intelligent creature would not be destroying its planet. It's our only home. And what have we done to it? If you think of the problems that we've created, we've got the warming globe, we've got loss of species, loss of biodiversity around the world, we've got pollution of air, water, and land, we've got industrial agriculture poisoning the soil with chemical pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides. We're polluting the water of the ocean with the runoff from agriculture, from industry, and from household waste. We've got the terrible problem of plastic. All of us have plastic in our bodies. Plastic is everywhere. And we've got the problem of poverty, because living in poverty, people may destroy the environment to survive, as around Gombe. And if you're in an urban area, you're going to buy the cheapest junk food, which has probably been very harmful to the environment, just because you can't afford to buy the rest. On the other hand, we've got to do something to curtail unsustainable lifestyles. Some people have so much more than they need. And I feel this very much from growing up in World War II, when everything was rationed, when you didn't take any mouthful for granted. And that was a big benefit for me, because I don't live unsustainably, at least I try not to. I do fly when I'm traveling 300 days a year, because nobody yet has given me a magic carpet.
Je suis tellement contente que le Dr Jane Goodall souligne que chaque individu compte. Je te le répète à l'envi depuis plus de 30 ans. Tu comptes, tu es assez, tu peux faire plein de choses, tu peux t'épanouir, tu peux changer le monde. Elle ajoute que chaque personne fait une différence. Toi qui m'écoutes, je te le répète, tu es importante parce que tu fais une différence dans le monde. J'apprécie aussi beaucoup qu'elle dise que nous ne sommes pas intelligents, parce qu'une créature intelligente ne détruirait pas sa planète, sa seule maison, et elle a entièrement raison avec ça. Et pourtant, le Dr Jane Goodall sillonne le monde, agit encore et toujours pour protéger la biodiversité et pour réparer, entre guillemets, les dégâts causés par l'humain depuis des décennies. Dans ce qui suit, le Dr Jane Goodall va te dire pourquoi elle espère, sur quoi reposent encore ses espoirs. Écoute-la bien, c'est puissant.
But right now, I see, people are asking me, Jane, do you really have hope? And I know the problems that the world faces, but I do have hope. I see our human beings, we're as though at the mouth of a very long, very dark tunnel, and right at the end there's a little star, and that's hope. But it's no good sitting at the mouth of the tunnel and waiting for that star to come. No, we have to roll up our sleeves. We have to climb over, crawl around, crawl under all the problems that I've mentioned that lie between us and the star. And the good news, there are groups of people tackling each one of these problems that I've mentioned and those that I haven't. But the sad thing is they're so often working in their own narrow little tunnel, in their own silo. And they may solve one problem, but they're not thinking holistically. And solving one problem may lead to another. And to give a very simple example, your group has managed to close down a coal mine. Yay! All that CO2 is no longer going up into the environment. But what about the people who've lost their jobs, falling into poverty, buying cheap, junky food, or even struggling worse to survive? There are groups of people training those whose industry has shut down into other ways of making a living. So if we'd thought holistically in the beginning, we'd work together. That's the answer for the future. No organization can do it alone. We need more collaboration, we need more partnerships, we need to think more holistically. And that's something I was talking to Audrey about earlier today. We need to collaborate to make the world a better place. And my reasons for hope, first of all, the young people, and I've talked about that, and it really is true that around the world they're making a huge, huge difference, and it's growing all the time. Secondly, there's the resilience of nature. If we give nature a chance, it will come back and again make beautiful places we've totally destroyed. If you fly over Gombe today, no more bare hills. The trees have come or are coming back, and with them the various animals, birds, insects, and so on. And animals on the very brink of extinction can be given another chance. I wrote a whole book about it, and it's still happening today. And then there's the human intellect. We are beginning to come to our senses and try to find ways of living in greater harmony with nature. Science coming up with renewable energy and so on. And we are beginning to think about our own environmental footsteps every day. What do we buy? Did it harm the environment? Was it cruel to animals? Is it cheap because of unfair wages? Then let's try and buy something more ethically produced. Will it cost a bit more? Almost certainly. But if it costs a bit more, you value it more and you waste less. Like I grew up in the war, we never wasted anything. And there are communities around the world that never waste anything. It's just in the affluent communities around the world that you see this terrible waste and these truly unsustainable lifestyles. So we're beginning to start thinking about that. And then there's what I call the indomitable human spirit, the people who tackle what seems impossible and won't give up, and so often succeed. There are people with terrific physical disabilities, and my goodness, do they inspire those around them? There's a man in Canada, and he was born with no arms and no legs. He has a little thing, I suppose, some kind of, I don't know, foot coming out of his thigh, and he's got tiny stumps of arms, and they're as thick as my wrist. He goes around the world on a skateboard. He hops up onto the sofa beside you, and you're looking into his face, and it's perhaps one of the most alive, intelligent faces I've ever looked into. That is the kind of indomitable spirit that surely will enable us to overcome the problems we face today. The last reason for hope is, I don't know if it's a reason for hope. You can think about it. But one of the worst things that we're facing today is war. Not just the two big wars, Ukraine and Russia, and Gaza and Israel, but conflicts around Africa, growing unrest around the world. And it's this dark side of chimpanzees which also we share with them. I lived through World War II, and there was a time when it was inevitable that we would be defeated by the Germans. All of Europe had been defeated or capitulated. Germany had a mighty air force, army, and navy. Britain was not prepared for war, not at all. We had just a little bit of barbed wire around the coast. But we had Winston Churchill, a flawed man, but the perfect leader for times of war, because he roused the British spirit. And he made this famous speech where he said, "We will never be defeated. We will defeat them on the beaches, in the roads, in the lanes, in the woods." And he turned aside to a friend and said, "We'll fight them with the ends of broken bottles, because that's all we've got." So he managed to bring in the United States, and we won the war. So there is hope for people living in war. There is hope because our young people, roots and shoots, we try to bring them together from different parts of the world. And as they get together as young people, these differences between nations fade away. And we find that coming from countries at war, the young people become friends. And the young people are realizing they're much more important than the color of your skin or your language or your culture or maybe even your religion, is the fact we're all human beings. We all laugh, we all cry, we all love. What we have to suppress, and what I hope the young people are helping us to do, we have to fight the fact we can all hate. So those are my reasons for hope. And I think it's very uplifting for me. I want to end with one story. And it's a story about how we need peace and harmony, not only with each other, but also with the natural world and animals. And it's a story about a chimpanzee, a big male, and he'd grown up alone. He didn't know anything about other chimpanzees, and he was introduced to a group. And he was attacked, and he was so terrified, he managed to get over the railing, which would protect him from falling into the deep water of the moat. And he started to drown because chimpanzees can't swim. And one of the visitors, jumped in, and he managed to grab this large male chimp, and he pushed him up onto the bank of the enclosure, and then turned to go back to his very worried family. But then the chimp started slipping down into the water again. And by this time, 3 of the other big males were approaching with their hair bristling, and male chimps are much stronger than us. And this man stood very still. He looked at his family, and then he looked at this chimp who's just falling into the water again, and he went back, and he pushed the chimp up until he was safely grabbing onto some grass. That evening, he was asked, "What made you do such a brave thing?" And he said, "Well, I looked into his eyes, and it was like looking into the eyes of a man. And the message was, won't anybody help me?" That's what the world is saying to us today. So let us get together, each do our bit in whatever way we can. Make the world better for the children who are coming after us, and help them to make the world better for themselves. Thank you.
Quelle femme inspirante, humble, droite dans ses bottes que le Dr Jane Goodall, une femme engagée. J'espère que tu écouteras plusieurs fois cet épisode, car il y a tellement à recevoir. Maintenant, nous allons clôturer avec Galitt Kenan, la directrice du Jane Goodall Institute France. Chère Galitt, pouvez-vous nous dire quel est selon vous l'impact le plus fort du Dr Jane Goodall sur les générations futures?
L'impact le plus fort du Dr Jane Goodall sur les générations futures? C'est une question pas facile parce que je trouve qu'il y en a beaucoup. D'abord, Jane est une rôle modèle, je trouve. C'est une femme, elle est scientifique, elle parle au cœur et pas uniquement à la tête. Elle part du principe que chacun d'entre nous peut avoir un impact chaque jour, et donc cet espoir qu'elle a chevillé au corps et je trouve très important, particulièrement actuellement dans ces périodes un peu sombres. Je pense que pour les générations futures, savoir que on ne compte pas que sur eux, mais on sait qu'ils seront là. Et ce message de paix et d'espoir de Jane est, j'espère, enthousiasmant et impactant.
Merci Galitt de vous plier à cet exercice compliqué et de répondre aussi brillamment, de façon aussi précise et pertinente. Merci infiniment. Dernière question. Avez-vous un dernier message ou un appel à l'action pour les auditeurs de ce podcast qui souhaitent s'engager davantage.
Si vous souhaitez vous engager, contactez-nous. Vraiment, n'hésitez pas, on serait ravis. Chacun d'entre vous peut faire une différence à nos côtés en devenant bénévole, en rejoignant notre programme Roots and Shoots, en nous accompagnant, en nous soutenant sur les réseaux sociaux, en donnant de votre temps, de l'argent. Il y a mille et une façons de pouvoir s'engager à nos côtés. Rejoignez-nous, nous vous attendons.